evening. On behalf of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, it's a real pleasure to welcome you all to today's edition of the Dan Schnur Political Report. I'm Dr. Richard Downey. I'm the president and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, and it is really a pleasure to have all of you join us tonight. There's a lot going on in our national politics today. There's so many of the picks that President-elect Trump has made that could be very consequential for what's going on in the years ahead here. But this past week, we have really seen some surprising events around the world. I mean, for example, we've seen in South Korea, the president declared martial law, and after resistance in the legislature, he took it away very quickly. We've seen a ceasefire in Lebanon with Israel, which could be consequential. But probably the most surprising thing of all was the speed of the collapse of the entire Syrian government under the regime under Bashar al-Assad. That Bashar family has been in control for over 50 years, and within a week after the attack by the HTS group in Syria, the Islamist group, they're now gone, and Bashar al-Assad is in Russia and for asylum. And so Dan tonight will be focusing more on the global challenges that confront the incoming Trump administration and U.S. administration more than our domestic piece. So it's going to be an exciting night, and it's something I know all of you are interested in hearing more about. What's going on in Syria, in the Middle East? What's the impact of this on for all the countries that we talk about? Russia, Iran, Israel, groups all throughout the Middle East. So we look forward to that. If we want you to be part of the conversation, of course, there's a Q&A session after about 30 minutes of Dan's discussion, and Madison Alt, who will handle the questions tonight, be our moderator. She'll take your questions. You can ask questions anytime by going to the box there. Ask your question anytime throughout the webinar, and Madison will ask that question. By the way, there's a members-only session afterwards. So if you didn't get your question answered during this portion of the webinar, the members-only session, you will get your questions answered. So please stay by for that. And if you're not a member, we welcome you to joining. It's easy to do. Just go to our website and sign up. We really appreciate that. I want to thank especially all of you who have donated to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. It is so crucial for us. We really appreciate it. But right now, we're in the midst of our year-end and giving campaign. And for those of you who are aware, know that nonprofits live or die on contributions. And I'm sure you've seen this now. December is the month that nonprofits all ask you for contributions, because it's right before the end of the year when your tax deductible contributions come into play and really are welcome. But like I'm sure you're seeing, my email and my letter mailbox are full from organizations asking for contributions right now, nonprofit organizations. And those of you who are watching this webinar and who are attendees on most of Dan's programs or other programs, you know the importance of what we do. In this very polarized political world we live in right now, it's so valuable to have an organization like the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, which provides a space for nonpartisan conversations where you can get informed, not by being biased, but by hearing all sides, and you can make up your own decisions. And that is so important today for all of us. So I hope you will give generously, especially those of you who are in a position to do so. We really need your support, and we ask for it, and we are very grateful to all of you who can do that. So it's easy to do. If you go to the chat, you'll see a link, and you can make a donation, and we hope you'll do that. And we will absolutely thank you and send you a something to for your tax deductible contribution, a record of that, which we really, really appreciate. But right now, let's get back. I know to what we all want, which is to hear about Dan Schnur talking about the fascinating events that have been going on around the world, and how the United States can respond to this and these many challenges. So, Dan, please take it from here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Richard. And thanks to all of you, as always, for being with us for this program. For those of you who've been with us over the years, you know that sometimes even our best laid plans fall by the wayside when news demands it. And as Richard explained, although we'd been talking about and had marketed a program today on the Trump transition, how Democrats are preparing for office, the recent events on the world stage all over the world really have demanded a change in our focus. And of course, knowing the interests of so many of you who are involved in our organization do tend to focus on the international stage. I don't think that will bother anyone. And I think we are going to try, if I'm not mistaken, Maddie, to get in a little bit of domestic politics at the end. But we are going to do everything we can to cover the world, or at least the parts of it that have been the most impactful. As always, I'm joined by the amazing Maddie Alt and by the equally amazing Krista Seitz. And between the three of us, we're going to work through the next hour, as usual, spending the first half or a little bit more talking about the world stage. And then toward the bottom of the hour, turning toward what I think most of you know is my favorite part of the webinar, which was when this monologue turns into a conversation and Maddie begins to sift through many of the questions that all of you send in. So over the course of the first half an hour, if there's anything I talk about that you want to discuss further, or anything I missed that you want to discuss, please let us know. And so before we go any further at all, already I'm going to ask for the first poll question, and then to hear from all of you what you think, and then we'll dive in from there. Well, Krista, if you can put up our first question. Okay, there we go. Question number one: which international issue do you believe is of greatest import? And we'll say, currently, as opposed to asking you to predict the future. Which international issue of those listed below do you believe is of the greatest current import? Number one, the Middle East. As Richard mentioned, of course, all sorts of news and developments in Syria, but also its effect on Iran, on Israel, and on the rest of the region. Option number two, China, of course, continues to create challenges and opportunities for the US and the West in all sorts of ways, but big news out of Korea and out of Japan as well. Third, as has been the case since, for a few years now, if not before, is the ongoings on in Europe, most notably between Russia and Ukraine, but turmoil in the governments in France and Germany as well. And then fourth, straddling international and domestic policy a little bit, developments in the debate over both US and global immigration policy and trade policy as we begin to head into an era of tariffs and more isolationism. So given those four options, let's see what our group thought is the most important. And no surprise here at all, half of our group pointed to the Middle East, and I would have been surprised if that weren't the case. 23%, a little bit less than a quarter, still appropriately point to Europe, particularly Russia and Ukraine, but these other countries as well, as what they believe is the greatest import. Pacific Rim, this is probably the first time I can think of, Maddie, since we've asked this question for some months, where Asia and China has not ranked higher in terms of our group's opinions. And immigration and trade policy, even though we're in a transitional rather than a substantive period here in the US, 15% there as well. So let's go to the Middle East. And Richard mentioned appropriately a few minutes ago just how fast the developments there have been. If I had told you a week ago or 10 days ago that there would have been a declaration of martial law in Korea, of elections suspended in Romania, of the Prime Minister of France and leadership of Germany either out or in danger. If I told you all those things were going to happen and we probably wouldn't have time to talk about any of them, I'm not sure you would have believed me. I'm not sure I would have believed myself. But of course, the story of the hour, or at least of this hour, is Syria. And we're going to discuss it tonight from several different angles. And again, as Richard mentioned, just the speed of the rebel takeover was astounding. On 1 week ago, the city of Aleppo fell to the rebels, and that was considered to be somewhat of a regional presence on their part. But by the weekend, Assad was in Moscow, fleeing for sanctuary. And by the beginning of this week, the insurgents have been setting up a new government for the country in Damascus, and there are all sorts of ramifications and repercussions for us to consider. The most obvious, which we'll dig into in just a moment, is what this means for Iran and its role in the region and its allies. What does this mean for the rest of the so-called Shiite Crescent? What does this mean for Hezbollah and Hamas? What does this mean for Lebanon? More broadly, what does it mean for Saudi Arabia? What does it mean for Israel? And even if you begin to reach beyond the Middle East, the impact on Turkey, on Russia, and therefore on Ukraine, on the EU, this is not just a Middle Eastern issue, this is a global issue. And we'll talk about as many of these different perspectives and potential impacts as possible. And then, like I said earlier, hopefully have time for a little bit of politics at the end. And of course, in the second half hour, go deeper either on these questions or on other topics of your choice. But before we go any further on Syria, let's put up the second question for our group, probably about as basic a question as we can ask about the revolution, about Assad's departure, about the new government being set up, and about the ripples throughout the Middle East and the world. Pretty simple, perhaps an oversimplified question. Do you think the recent events in Syria are a good thing or a bad thing? No nuance here at all. Good, bad, or balances out. And I recognize that a more specific question about a good or a bad thing for whom and under what circumstances, it is a much more complicated question. But let's see what our group has to say at the most basic level. Really interesting. 69%, more than 2/3 of our respondents, believe that the recent changes in Syria are a good thing or a bad thing. Or excuse me, are a good thing, my fault. Only 3%, a very small number of you, think it's a bad thing. And we will talk both about the opportunities and the challenges in just a minute. So we're going to address both sides of this. In 29%, a little bit more than a quarter, not quite a third of you, not surprisingly, are still waiting to see how things unfold and saying, at least for now, maybe it balances out. But Maddie, if I do my math right, on the good versus bad ratio, we are talking about a 31-to-1 ratio of our group who thinks that what's happened there is a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Very interesting. I don't know if those were the results I was necessarily expecting, but we'll get into it. And so I guess that's kind of where I want to go with you, which is asking what are the opportunities that come out of this? But on the flip side, what are the risks that we're undertaking just as a whole with this situation?
Well, I think that's exactly right. And even though a much smaller number of individuals in our group talked about this as a potentially bad thing, I think it is important for us to talk about these changes, both in terms of opportunities and of challenges. The opportunities are extraordinary, and I mentioned this just a moment ago. For decades, for most of the modern era, the so-called Shiite Crescent, of which Iran has been the foundation, it has been one of the two linchpins of political power, of geopolitical power in the Middle East. And Iran and its allies, Syria and Lebanon, and under some circumstances, Iraq, and its proxy armies with Hezbollah, represented by Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis, that has represented an extraordinarily powerful threat to the entire region, particularly to Israel, but to the Middle East and beyond. And if you look at the events of the last couple of weeks in the context of what we've seen in the region over the last year to 15 months, it's very clear how weakened Iran has become. They have spent decades building up these proxy powers to help protect them and support them. And at this point, almost all of them are gone. Lebanon technically exists, but for all practical purposes, it is a failed state at the hands of Hezbollah. Hezbollah has all but been destroyed by the Israeli military. And while Hamas is still fighting a resistance in Gaza, it's very clear that the impact of their October 7th attacks are much different than they had originally predicted, and that Hamas is really holding on by its fingernails right now. So with Hezbollah, with Hamas, with Lebanon, all either out of existence or barely in existence, Syria is the last remaining substantive ally of Iran. And while there are many, many unknowns about what the new insurgent coalition that appears will run Syria in the future will do, we can say with some confidence that given past animosity between these insurgents and Iran, it's extremely unlikely that the new Syria and Iran will have anywhere near the kind of relationship that they've had in the past. So the most immediate opportunities, and we'll go more broadly in just a minute, is what this means to Iran. And I'm not sure what that is ringing, so you'll just have to hang with me for a second. But in any case, we also need to talk about challenges, because there are a lot of unknowns there. And I'm glad that even though there were just a small number, that a few of our group members registered their concern as it related to the events in Syria. We don't know a lot about these rebels, but what we do know is that we know that many of them are on international terrorist watch lists. Both the United States and the United Nations have listed them as terrorist organizations, primarily because of their past association with Al-Qaeda and with ISIS. And those who currently moved into positions of authority are promising a level of tolerance. And what we've already seen in Aleppo, the northern city, which has become the first place where the rebels have installed their own government, this is not a Taliban-style occupation. They are not cracking down on religious minorities. They are not imposing very strict religious doctrine. And they do seem content to govern in at least a more relatively conventional way. But we don't know how extreme they'll end up to be when they govern. And we don't know because this is a very uneasy coalition of a lot of different rebel groups. We don't know if they'll be able to govern together or whether we'll see Syria factionalize into any number of individual geographical regions, each controlled by a different rebel group. It's worth remembering that historically speaking, there's no such thing as the nation of Syria. This is something that was created by Western powers earlier in the 20th century. And this was a forced marriage, if you will, between a number of different religions, a number of different ethnic groups. So there's never been a national alliance except for what Assad and his father have attempted to impose. We don't know if that's going to hold together. And already we're seeing tensions between Turkey and its proxies, between the Kurds, who the US is supporting, and Israel attempting to create a buffer zone between their country and southern Syria. So it's very volatile. And while the opportunities, particularly the weakened and vulnerable Iran, are tremendous, there's a lot of unknowns. The biggest question, before we go on, giving some potential positives and some potential threats, the biggest question is how Iran reacts to its new vulnerable status. To put it simply, at this point in history, the Ayatollah has no clothes. And just like in the old story, the emperor has no clothes, the leader of that mythical kingdom was treated as if there was nothing amiss. Well, Iran's leaders no longer have the kind of protections I was talking about earlier, and that could lead them to go into one of two different directions. Number one, because Iran's conventional military protection, both in terms of its own military, which was exposed as extremely vulnerable by Israel's Air Force earlier this year, but also its client states and its proxy terrorist groups, because conventional military protections simply don't offer any real relief to Iran at this point. The question is now, do the Iranians begin to move once again even more aggressively to nuclear weapons? Thinking if conventional arms can no longer protect us, do we need nuclear weapons so we're not completely exposed? And there's no question that that's a very real possibility. The other option, though, for Iran is to go not so much in an opposite direction, but in a very different direction. You may remember, or many of you may remember, and I know you remember, Maddie, that last year, China, very improbably, attempted to broker negotiations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And as we talked about earlier, if Iran and the Shiite Crescent was one power bulwark in the Middle East for years and years and years, well, Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states and more moderate states like Egypt and Jordan were sort of the counterweight in that region. And the Saudis and the Iranians have had very, very bad relationships for a long time, but China stepped in last year and tried to broker some types of conversations. And at the time, it appeared that what came out of it was nothing all that substantive, but at least they were talking. And from China's perspective, it at least gave that country a foothold in the Middle East that it had lacked before. So what's entirely possible now is, given Iran's vulnerability, either instead of or along with its renewed pursuit of nuclear weapons, could they instead turn back to the bargaining table and sit down with China and Saudi Arabia, if not to buttress its military protections, to try to achieve some kind of diplomatic progress? And so to me, that's the real question here. Because lastly, and then we do want to go to our next poll question, if it does look like that Iran, and I want y'all to stick with me on this one because it gets a little bit complicated. If Iran does decide that making a more legitimate effort to normalize relationships with Saudi Arabia is in their interest, well, then that increases pressure on Israel to do the same thing. We all know that ever since the Abraham Accords were passed several years ago, that getting Saudi Arabia to normalize its relationships with Israel as part of the Abraham Accords would be a huge achievement for Israel, for the Saudis, and for the US. Those negotiations have stalled since October 7th of last year, since the Hamas attacks on Israel. But if Israel's leaders saw Saudi Arabia and Iran beginning to talk more seriously, that would increase the pressure on Israel to work more seriously and more forcefully with Saudi Arabia to come to an agreement of their own. And what that would leave us with is a Middle East in which Saudi Arabia, which already plays, of course, an extremely powerful and influential role, Saudi Arabia would need to decide on whether it wanted diplomatic relationships with Iran or with Israel. So there's a lot going on there, but not too much for our group. So I'm going to ask you to put up the third poll question. And we're going to ask all of you to offer your best assessment on what Saudi Arabia would do under those circumstances. If Iran does make renewed outreach with help from the Chinese, as was the case last year, if Israel, seeing a potential Iran or Saudi Arabia alliance, were to strengthen its outreach, which direction do the Saudis go? Do they ally with Israel in order to present a united front against Iran and the Shiite Crescent? Or does Saudi Arabia see another Arab state as a more natural ally? And if Iran's willing to make concessions in its weakened state, decide to go in that direction instead? So question for all of you. If that choice were to emerge, where do you think Saudi Arabia heads? Oh, really interesting. And Natty, I don't know about you, but I'm somewhat surprised by those numbers. 72%, almost 3/4 of our group, believes that given the option, that Saudi Arabia's leadership would ally with Israel against Iran rather than the other direction. Really interesting, don't you think?
I really do. This is definitely another surprising result, but I'm kind of wondering, Dan, what do you think is the most likely scenario? Do you think that Saudi Arabia would be more likely to form an alliance with Iran, or do you agree with our group's assessment here that it would actually be Israel?
Well, our group's a lot more courageous than I am. I have to admit, I don't know the answer, but I will tell you what I think could direct Saudi Arabia in one direction or not, and it's a very simple question. Ever since last October 7th, ever since the original Hamas invasion, Saudi Arabia has essentially upped its ask. They've increased its demands in exchange for normalization of relationships with Israel. And they've been very clear, which is they will only enter a formal alliance with Israel if Israel is willing to recognize a Palestinian state. So an Israel-Saudi alliance requires a two-state solution. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu and most of the Israeli government and most of the Israeli people oppose a two-state solution. Most of the rest of the world thinks it's a really good thing, which Bibi has used to his advantage in Israeli domestic politics to rally support for himself, even when he's otherwise faced real challenges, saying, hey, the rest of the world is against us on this one. I'm going to hold firm. So here's the question, it seems to me, is whether Israel would agree to a Palestinian state. Up until now, they have not, for all the reasons we've discussed. But would the prospect of a Saudi Arabia-Iran alliance encourage Israel to support a two-state solution? Or alternatively, could the US develop sufficiently vague language about a roadmap to statehood for Palestine, short of a formal agreement, which would satisfy Saudi Arabia and the other stakeholders? And I know that our group does lean somewhat leftward, and we have a lot more Trump opponents than supporters in our group. But I will say this without taking sides, is that whether you consider yourself a big fan or an ardent foe of Donald Trump, it's hard to argue that his relationship, both with Benjamin Netanyahu and with the leaders of Saudi Arabia, are much stronger than the Biden administration's. And while I don't feel confident in making a prediction, I think therefore Trump is much better equipped, should he as an administration decide to do so, to try to pressure Israel into agreeing to at least a roadmap or a pathway to a Palestinian state that would therefore then allow the Saudis to ally with Israel and not with Iran. That's a lot of ifs, but that's how I'm cowardly couching my own predictions. But if we assume, all of you, that a Saudi Arabia-Israel pact would require a two-state solution, let's put up our fourth question if we can. And let's see what our group thinks about this. All right. If it's going to require a Palestinian state to get Saudi Arabia to sign on with Israel rather than Iran, what do you think? Do you believe that there'll be an independent Palestinian state in the future? The options are pretty straightforward. Yes, I think it will happen within a year. We'll say objectively by the end of 2025. I think, yes, there'll be a Palestinian state, but it'll take a little bit more time, 1 to 5 years. Third, it'll happen, but it'll take an even longer time. We'll say 5 to 10 years. Alternatively, it'll take even longer than that there will be a Palestinian state someday, but it's going to take 10 years or more to do it. Or finally, the last answer is there is never going to be an independent Palestinian state. And let's see what our group had to say. Oh, look at that. Also very interesting. Only 1%, that's not surprising, think that will happen within a year. Only 16% say never. I find that very interesting. And only 12 additional percent say it'll take 10 more years. So only a little bit more than a quarter of our group say long term or never. If you add up those two, that second and third category, within 1 to 5 years and within 5 to 10 years, that's 70%. That's more than 2/3 of our group that think it's going to take a while, but there will be a Palestinian state. And if we follow our formulation, that it will require a two-state solution for Saudi Arabia to ally with itself with Israel rather than Iran, then it appears that our group thinks that that will happen, and therefore the Saudis will sign up with Israel. Really interesting. I know this isn't what we planned on talking about today, but it is really, really fascinating to watch what our group has to think on these things.
Absolutely. Dan, I am wondering, where would you cast your vote if you were able to take this poll?
Okay. I think there will be an independent Palestinian state. And it's possible that in a year or less, that there could be some fairly vague language like I talked about earlier, a pathway, a roadmap, enough language to move the diplomacy in the right direction without having a final agreement. But I do believe either under Netanyahu, working with a centrist coalition, as opposed to the ultra-conservative alliance he has now within Israeli government, that either under Netanyahu with a different governing coalition or the prime minister after Netanyahu will preside over the establishment of two states. I think back to Ariel Sharon, who was probably Israel's most aggressive leader before Netanyahu back in the late 20th century. He was known as the bulldozer, given his very strong support for Israeli settlements in West Bank and Gaza. At a certain point, as many of you remember, even Ariel Sharon, the bulldozer, pulled out of Gaza because he believed that that would ultimately provide for better security for Israel. And I suspect Netanyahu, if he knows that he could be remembered as the Israeli leader who forged an agreement not with just with Saudi Arabia, but more broadly with Jordan and Egypt and the Gulf states and so on, if Netanyahu thinks he could go down in history as the Israeli leader who remade the Middle East, I think he'd cut that deal. But it would require him separating himself from his most conservative allies. And that's something he's been really reluctant to do while the trial and while the legal proceedings against him have been going on. But once again, whether you like Trump or despise him, Donald Trump is very popular in Israel. And Netanyahu is smart enough to know is that a solution like this with Trump's support could give Netanyahu sufficient cover to continue. So I think there will be a two-state solution. I don't think it'll be formal within a year, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see language by the end of 2025 that has us heading in that direction to a much greater degree than we do today. Hey, Maddie, I know we were going to try to squeeze in a little bit of domestic politics, but we're already past 5:30 here. What do you say we save the domestic stuff for next month, unless our audience has questions on what's going on in this country? But let's, what do you say we switch to questions rather than continue to go on?
I think we should. And I think that's, you'll see through the questions that we will kind of dip a little bit into US foreign policy in addition to the questions about our current topic. So if we want to get started, we'll start with our, I guess, in the same vein of our current topic, which is talking about, and please correct me if I'm pronouncing this wrong. It's the Sunni Shia divide.
Yeah.
And how would it be a significant roadblock for Saudi Arabia agreeing to an alliance with Iran, as both are kind of competing to be the major power? But would that, I guess the question is more asking, would that be a significant roadblock, that divide there in terms of ideology?
So it's a really smart question. The Shiite regions, the Shia regions of the Middle East, as we talked about earlier, Iran, Lebanon, Syria, much of Iraq, and the Sunni regions, both the Gulf states and Jordan and Egypt, have been at odds for many, many years. But it's worth remembering that Sunni Shiite divide is not permanent. For many years, really since the inception of the State of Israel in 1948 and even before, we did see a much more unified Arab universe. And it's only been in more recent years that the divide between Shiite and Sunni countries has become so pronounced. I believe that there'd be at least some temptation on both Iran's and Saudi Arabia's part to put aside their differences within the broader Islam rubric if there was an achievable partnership to be developed. Now, so many tensions have developed so much violence has taken place that it would be a huge lift. And it's not really clear, and it hasn't been for the last year, whether China is working with both Saudi Arabia and Iran because they believe that agreement can be reached, or because China just likes the idea of having a footprint in the region. But I would say to the questioner, and it is a very smart question, is keep in mind that while this divide has existed within the Islam faith for centuries, the geopolitics of it in the modern Middle East has not existed forever. And you don't have to go that far back when you saw Shia and Sunni countries working together primarily in their opposition to Israel and the United States, which therefore would explain to me why Israel would be so incentivized to prevent that alliance from coming back together, and why the US would be so incentivized to do everything they could to keep it from happening also.
Thank you, Dan. That was a great answer. And actually, kind of still touching in that same vein, you did make a point earlier about Iran possibly moving more aggressively towards nuclear weapons, given their weakened state. Do you see the Trump administration, sort of tying in that our foreign policy, moving to take out those nuclear weapons with the use of the military, or what kind of approach do you think the Trump administration will have to Iran possibly moving towards nuclear power?
I think it's very unlikely that we would see the Trump administration use US military force, whether missiles or soldiers or anything else. I think it's very unlikely you'd see a direct US involvement in Iran. Because I think if we look back at Trump's first 4 years in office, with certain targeted exceptions, he generally is not someone who's very aggressive when it comes to the use of US military. He likes sanctions, he likes trade wars, and although there have been some individual engagements, he's very hesitant, it seems to me, to engage the US military on a broader scale. What I think would change, though, and I think this is why the question is so important, is even while the US isn't any more likely to engage with Iran militarily under Trump than under Biden or Obama or other modern day presidents, I do believe that the Trump administration would be much less likely to stand in Israel's way of direct engagement with Iran. And the Biden administration, Obama, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, never, of course, threatened military action against Israel, but they've offered a series of warnings over the years to try to prevent Israel from a direct military strike on Iran, worrying about the potential region-wide conflagration that would follow. I'm guessing, and it is just a guess, that under Donald Trump, the U.S. would be much more likely to step out of the way and tell either Netanyahu or his successor, using Trump's own words, Bibi, do what you have to do.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. Still kind of keeping with that same topic. So we have a question, and this one's interesting just because we've had a similar question before based on different catalysts and different topics, which is do any of the conflicts that are currently going on in the Middle East have the potential to be a catalyst into World War III? And like I said, that's been a question that we've had before with different conflicts in front of that question. But do you see any potential for this to become like an all-out world war based on the many different conflicts and collapses that we see going on right now?
Boy, could any of these tensions in the Middle East lead to a third world war? You never say never, particularly given the spread of nuclear weapons and the likely further spread of nuclear weapons. But it's difficult to see. I wouldn't say it can't happen. I wouldn't say it won't happen, but I think it's improbable, because I think even while the Iranian leadership is very fanatical in all sorts of ways, I think recognizing the nuclear war would mean not just destruction of many other places in the world, but of their own country and their own society as well. I think they'd be reluctant to do that. I don't think a third world war is likely in Europe also, but I have to say I believe it is somewhat more likely that if Russia's war with Ukraine were to spread into other places of Eastern Europe, that's more likely to become a broader global conflict than I think the hostilities in the Middle East might.
That leads us kind of right into our next shift, which is asking about the situation that is going on over in Europe. And it's one of the questions is asking, how will the war in Ukraine and U.S. support for Ukraine play out under the Trump administration?
Trump has made it very clear that he is not interested in continuing U.S. support for the war in Ukraine. And there's a couple things going on as a result of that. One, Trump, and he's now talked with Zelensky a couple of times, one right after winning the election, and the second they met in person, along with the French Prime Minister, Macron, who brokered a meeting between the two. And what Trump appears to be saying is that he wants a ceasefire. It's not clear how much of Ukrainian territory that Russia currently holds would remain under Russia's purview. But Trump is very cognizant of his domestic political support base in this country. And he knows that his strongest supporters here tend to be very isolationist, not just on trade, not just on diplomacy, not just on immigration, but militarily too. They just want these wars over. And so Trump, as a result, has said very loudly and very forcefully to both Ukraine and to Russia, and also to Israel and Hamas, this had better be done pretty quickly. So what the terms of that ceasefire would be are something we can't predict right now. But it appears that Trump, after taking office, will lean not just on Ukraine, but on both sides to stop the hostilities sooner rather than later. The other thing that's going on very quickly is because Ukraine, depending on how much land Trump would like to see them allow Russia to keep, it's very clear that Europe, which obviously has a much more immediate geographic concern than the US does across the Atlantic Ocean, that many of Europe's leaders are already talking about whether their countries and their militaries can take on a greater role. And in particular, I'd encourage those of you who haven't, there are meetings taking place over the next couple days between the leaders of France and Poland, two very different countries on opposite sides of Europe, geographically and ideologically, talking about what more they could be doing in a Trump administration to aid Ukraine. So depending on what type of ceasefire Trump pushes for, we either see Ukraine and Russia back down, or alternatively, we see Europe step up and become that much more aggressive in providing its support for Ukraine.
Thank you so much. And actually, another question that kind of relates is asking if the fall of Assad and the failure of Russia to prop up the regime is indicative of decline of Russian power being drained by the war in Ukraine. What do you think about that?
A really, really good question. Most of you remember that back in the 2010s, when Assad was waging war against his own people, the only thing that saved him was massive support from Russia and from Iran. Both of them stepped up in massive levels and provided cover for Assad to continue his assault, including the use of chemical weapons, and often aided in the attacks against the rebel groups. And so one of the reasons that I believe that the new Syria, however the leadership is configured, will not be a close ally of Iran's the way it has been under Assad, is because so many of those rebels were on the receiving end of Iranian fire less than a decade ago. So Iran was not in a position to help Assad the way they did in 2017 because of what's been happening in terms of their hostilities with Israel and Hezbollah's and Hamas's as well. But by the same token, and the question is really smart to raise it, Russia, of course, has been focusing all of its attention and energies in Ukraine to a point where it's had to pull back from some of its military presence in other parts of the world, where it's now deploying North Korean troops in the occupied areas of Western Russia. So Russia, like Iran, simply no longer had the military bandwidth to come to Assad's aid the way they did in the 2010s. And it was the Ukraine war in particular that prevented Putin from following up the way he had previously.
Speaking of Assad still, we have a question that's asking what role you think Turkey will have in a post-Assad Middle East and how it's going to change very dramatically over the next coming months.
So the only country that's as much of a wild card in this whole equation than Iran is Turkey. And Turkey, of course, has very serious border issues. And their biggest concern is a very large and very restive Kurdish population, which occupies portions of Turkey, portions of Iran, and portions of Syria. Turkey is very, very concerned and has been for many years that if a Kurdish state or even Kurdish-run regional government were to emerge in Iran or Syria, that would lead to revolt among Turkish Kurds wanting to leave Turkey and join with this new Kurdish nation. So Turkey has for years supported rebel groups that have not only taken on Assad, but have attacked the Kurds as well. Now, the US, for all sorts of reasons, has been an ally of the Kurds. And at one point, for a day or two over the last week, we actually saw Turkish-backed rebel groups and US-backed rebel groups. US and Turkey, both members of NATO, both supporting rebel groups who are in direct conflict with each other. Now, to some degree at least, cooler heads have prevailed, and that direct conflict no longer exists. But ultimately, Turkey is going to have to decide how willing they are to compromise. And a Kurdish presence is almost a given in the new Syrian leadership arrangement. How many Kurds and what sort of leadership and what sort of role are the unknowns. Now, the difference, of course, between Iran and Turkey is that while Erdogan and Turkey's other leaders can be very problematic, diplomatically, economically, militarily, at least for the most part, they engage in multinational discussions and negotiations. They might not be all that cooperative, but they generally at least tend to participate. So while they have not been an ideal partner on any of these fronts over the years for the US or for much of Europe, they're a much, much more reliable, sometimes ally than Iran, which is obviously not at all. So Turkey's a problem. Turkey's a threat, but it's not nearly as big of a problem or a threat as Iran has been. So think of that as market progress. Think of that as some progress.
Actually, I want to touch on something you said about rebel groups. There's a question that's asking if there's a potential for Syria to end up divided like old Czechoslovakia, because there are multiple factions that exist currently in that situation. I want to know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, at this point, there's no way to know. I mean, it's just simply impossible to predict this early what the future of Syria will look like. And I think there's one of two possible outcomes. One is, as the questioner suggested, is that you end up with several regional factions, maybe not separate countries, but different parts of the country divided between these different groups, ethnically, religiously, and so on, all competing for power with different agendas and with different allies and enemies like we've been talking about. What I think is less likely, but still possible, would be for them to form some type of unified national governing structure with representatives from many of these various groups. But even if that were to take place, that kind of arrangement would almost certainly struggle with the same kind of rivalries and disagreements just within a government, not between regional governments. I would say this, though, that most of these groups don't have a great amount of love for Israel, but they'll no longer have the unity or the firepower to represent the type of threat regionally that's been the case throughout the Assad dynasty. I think the one thing to keep in mind on this, just real quick before I go on, Maddie, is the biggest of these groups is the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham organization. And HTS, as they're known, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is a direct offshoot from Al-Qaeda and ISIS ancestry. And HTS is on, as I said earlier, currently on both US and United Nations terrorist lists. So their leaders have pledged a much more accommodating, less restrictionist approach. That's appeared to be the case after the first few days, but it's only been a few days. And so one of the real challenges going forward, not just for the US, but for us, other Western democracies, is to figure out what kind of tests to set for the new Syrian government to give them a chance to prove that they're not interested in that kind of belligerence. And we just don't know the answer to that yet.
Mhm. Thank you. I am going to switch us over towards more domestic policy, but it does have a tie-in. And it's asked, there's a question asking of Trump's controversial proposed appointments so far, like RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard. What do you think is the most potential, I guess, risk to the general functioning of our country? And in that same tie-in, it's sort of a double question. Do the current events in Syria impact Trump's choice for Director of National Intelligence, as that is currently Tulsi Gabbard? What do you think about that?
Yeah, of course, one of the greatest controversies surrounding Gabbard's nomination is not just the very many sympathetic comments she's made about Russia, particularly as it relates to the Ukraine war over the years, but the fact that she has spent time with Assad in the past, even while he was engaged in aggression against his own people. And initially, it looks like the focus of our nation's attention back on Syria might end up somewhat harming her, because it's reminding people that she did spend time in somewhat collaborative ways with Assad at a very ugly time in his and his country's history. But I have to admit, going forward, I don't know if that will sustain. I suspect at least one more of Trump's cabinet members will not survive. We've already seen Matt Gaetz, of course, step aside. I suspect one more will not make it, but I think most of them will. And whether it's Gabbard or Kash Patel, the FBI nominee, whether it's Robert F. Kennedy, whether it's Hespeth over at Defense, we don't know who it's going to be that doesn't make it, but most of them will get through, because even if a few Republican senators do vote against Trump, they're not going to do it on many of his nominees. And I wonder if now that Assad is past tense, that he's no longer in power, that might, within a week or two or three, lower the temperature for her rather than raising it. In the immediate, it's a potential challenge for her, but there's no way to predict whether that ends up remaining the case by the time she comes up for a confirmation vote.
Thank you. And still speaking about Trump's appointments, you mentioned a few people will be stepping in, and the question is asking, why are there various current high-level people like Jack Smith and Christopher Wray resigning rather than making Trump fire them?
Well, I don't know. There's no way to know the answer to that. But my guess is one of two things, perhaps a combination of two. Both Smith and Wray are patriots. Both believe in the rule of law. And while they may disagree heartily with a decision by their commander in chief, if they believe that he no longer wants them in the job, then they see it as part of their responsibility to step aside. So think of this as a particularly honorable way of recognizing an authority, even if it's one with which they don't agree. The other, I think a little bit less high-minded, but just as understandable, is Trump has talked on a number of occasions about jailing his enemies. And it's entirely possible that Wray or Smith or others who've been involved in some of these matters in the past might decide that just for the self-preservation and safety of themselves and the people they care about, better to step away in a way with somewhat less animosity. My guess is that years from now, one or both of them will write books in which we'll get better answers. Until then, let's assume it's a combination of honor and respect for the hierarchy, combined with an understandable instinct for self-preservation.
Thank you. All right, we do have a question, and it is shifting topics a little bit, but we talked a lot about Israel and its relationship with other relationships with other countries in the Middle East, and there, as most of our audience probably knows, there have been a few countries that have issued arrest warrants, or have been saying that if Benjamin Netanyahu visits, they will arrest him. Do you think that it's likely that he will be convicted and put in jail, or potentially exiled? What do you think is the most likely scenario in this case?
Boy, I have to admit that while I follow the politics of Israel very closely, I don't know enough about the Israeli legal system to know what the odds are for a conviction or acquittal for Netanyahu. What is clear, and of course his trial started this week, is Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister and chief executive of the state of Israel, is going to be in a courtroom 6 hours a day from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., 3 days a week for the foreseeable future. And so whether, again, you happen to be a supporter or an opponent of Netanyahu's, I'm not sure it's ideal for any country, particularly one at such a sensitive point in its own history, to have its leader unavailable for his job for several hours a day for the better part of a week going forward. Um, I don't know. The charges, of course, center on bribery and corruption. And what I don't know about Israeli law is what the penalties for those types of alleged crimes are. What I think is more likely than this case being decided one way or another is Netanyahu finding a way either to leave office under his own terms with the Saudi agreement or otherwise, or somehow forging an agreement with a more centrist coalition than the one he currently has, which will allow him to begin to segue in that direction. I can't imagine he and his lawyers would have fought this hard to keep the trial from coming to court if they did not think there was a reasonable possibility of conviction. But it's equally improbable to me to see Netanyahu sit idly by and let such a thing happen. My guess is if the legal proceedings begin to head in that direction, you'll see a political outcome before you see a judicial outcome.
Thank you, Dan. All right. And so we have, I think, probably time for one more to get in there.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm kind of tying again back to the US policy, but also tying into Israel. Obviously, we've seen both Trump and Biden, they have different relationships with Netanyahu and with Israel, but relationships nonetheless. And we are obviously going through a big transition ourselves as a country. And during this transition time, we're sort of hearing more about Trump and absolutely nothing about Joe Biden, and this big transition that's going on right now is sort of already kind of moved over towards Trump being the main topic of the news cycle. But I am still wondering what you think about who has more influence on these issues, especially with this issue in Syria coming up so suddenly. And do you think the incoming or outgoing president has more impact on this currently?
Well, this is always a tricky time in American history. With a transition period of 2.5 months, there's always some tension between an outgoing president who technically is still in charge and an incoming president who's preparing to assume that authority. And so it's always a little bit nebulous. But I think it's a much bigger dichotomy this year. One, because Trump is just a naturally aggressive individual. And second, Biden, whether it's because of his age or other reasons, has been somewhat reticent. And I will say that his decision to pardon and to announce the pardon of his son, Hunter Biden, I think intensified the feeling that he was on his way out the door. The Washington Post ran a story over the weekend talking about the US and Syria. And the headline of the piece was as follows. The headline was, Trump calls for hands-off approach to Syria as Assad regime falls. And then underneath the headline, the subhead, as they call it, almost as an afterthought, it said, the White House says President Joe Biden is also monitoring the situation and communicating with regional partners. So you got the Washington Post, one of the nation's largest and most influential newspapers, giving a big headline to what somebody who isn't president wants to be done. And then a smaller headline underneath, also, the current president is also, keeping his eye on this. So look, Joe Biden, is still the commander in chief of the military. Yeah, he holds the nuclear codes. He will sign legislation and appoint judges and make other policy-based decisions until 11:59 a.m. on January 20th. But there's no question that in the eyes of the media, in the eyes of the American public, and in the eyes of most of the world's leaders, while Donald Trump is not technically the president of the United States, he's being treated like the president much more than Biden is. And that's something that we'll have a chance to talk about next month because, of course, our next gathering will be immediately before the inauguration, if I'm not mistaken.
I think you're right on that. Awesome. Thank you so much, Dan. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Maddie. As always, great job. You and Krista are terrific. And thanks to all of our group for gathering here today. And if I can just, before I give it back to Richard, echo a point that he made earlier. We love providing these programs to both members and non-members alike. But whether you're a member or a non-member, paying the salaries of Krista and Maddie and the rest of a really terrific staff does require financial support. And we're grateful for any support that you can give to make sure that these amazing people who do such great work for us can continue to do so.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. And I certainly want to echo those points that Dan made. As I mentioned earlier, we live or die as a nonprofit on your contributions, and especially now during this time when it's tax deductible for you to make a donation. Please do so if you can, if you're in position to do so. We thank you very much, all of you who have donated, but we really do need your help. So please give if you're in a position to do so. And it's easy to do. You can go to the link that's in the chat. You can go to our website, and trust me, checks work just fine. So we really appreciate that. But so thank you, Dan, for that. But Dan, thank you so much for, as always, your just wonderful, insightful analysis and helping us to unpack all these. By the way, I couldn't agree more that the focus on what you talked about in terms of these global challenges really is the priority. Although you certainly did get the questions which in a very clear way, I think identified a lot of the domestic issues, and I very much appreciate that, and I know our audience did. But I think the priority. I thank you for helping to clarify for us some of what was going on in the Middle East and around the world. So I think it was very important. I also want to thank.
And hopefully we'll get back to U.S. politics next month.
Yeah, I have the feeling since it's right before the election, we definitely will, Dan. And I thank you very, very much as always. I also want to thank our audience. Your questions are terrific. We love having you as part of this. We love your questions, and I know Dan enjoys answering them. I certainly enjoy hearing them because you guys always give thought-provoking kinds of things. And this will continue for our members in the members-only session. So if you're not a member, please join up and you can participate in that. But also want to thank Madison and Krista for Madison, great job on moderating, and for Krista for helping coordinate all the back part of this to make it all work. It's a team effort. It truly is, and I want to thank you. But again, it's one last plug. This is that time. Really, we appreciate your help for the end of your campaign. But thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you again, Dan, and you all have a great night.